Welcome to our lecture today on aggression, testosterone, and the biological basis of behavior. And I'm really happy that Dean Gregory Ball accepted to give this talk today. I will introduce him to you in a minute. But first of all, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi. I am the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at this university. And I would like to acknowledge a special group of students who have helped us today, the BSOS ambassadors from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. We appreciate their assistance, and of course to my very competent assistant director of the chair, Dr. Kate Seaman, and students, interns, Ashley Taylor and Alawi Masood. Thank you very much for your help today. So today's lecture falls under 5 themes that the Baha'i Chair explores throughout the year in relation to the complex spectrum of what we call peace. And the 5 are human nature, which is today's lecture is about this, advancement of women in peace, structural racism and the root cause of prejudice, the environment in a globalizing society, globalizing world, and global governance. So these 5 themes are extremely important to us because the more we learn about them, the more we can understand what the barriers are to a more integrative approach to peace. So today's lecture, as I said, explores human nature. And because we are interested in the interdisciplinary learning of all these topics, I think it's really important that we hear from a neuropsychological perspective what it has to offer in relation to our understanding human nature better. So are humans inherently aggressive, selfish, competitive, violent? What have we learned about human nature and the fact that humans can massacre one another but also perform spectacular acts of altruism and kindness? Is one side of human nature destined to win out over the other? The neurobiologist, a friend of Dr. Ball, Robert Sapolsky, in his book entitled Behave, A Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, explains that it makes no sense to distinguish between aspects of behavior that are biological and those that would be described as psychological or cultural. He says they are utterly intertwined. So what does this say about human nature? Today's lecture explores the biological basis of behavior and the causal web involving variables such as genes, hormones, and nervous system activity that is profoundly modified by experience and culture. We are fortunate to have with us Dean Ball to expand our knowledge about this very important and complex topic. Just a little bit about him. Dean Ball came to the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland in the fall of 2014. Prior to joining us here, he was Vice Dean of Science and Research Infrastructure in the Krieg School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University and a professor in the Department of Psychology and Psychological and Brain Sciences. As Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, he oversees one of the largest colleges at the University of Maryland. In addition to his duties as dean, he maintains a research lab in the Department of Psychology, and he is a very highly accomplished scientist with over 235 research publications. And he'll probably tell you what his research is about, so I won't go into too much more detail about it. But just so you know, he earned his BA in psychology from Columbia University and a PhD in physiobiology from the Institute of Animal Behavior at Rutgers University. He did his postdoctoral work at Rockefeller University and held faculty appointments there at Boston College and the Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming Dean Ball.
Careful. That's all right. Thank you, Hoda, for your kind introduction.
And I forgot to say the hashtag for today is at Baha'i Chair. Okay.
When I arrived here 4 years ago, I started having conversations with Hoda and some of the other peace chairs about this important feature of our college and our university, and how pleased I was to have them showing leadership in taking on topics that are just fundamental to our society that all too often universities ignore. Sometimes we're afraid, especially in a secular state university like ours, to take on things like moral responsibility, tolerance, how we approach the world from the perspective of ensuring peace. And I greatly admire Hoda and her colleagues in the peace chairs, Shibli Tahami and May Rehani, and the great work they do. Hoda and I had a long conversation over the 4 years that would start and stop about my work, and I would talk about how people often assume that when you study biological variables, you immediately are studying things that are immutable, that determine how people are, and would suggest that certain people are bad and certain people are good. And of course, it's far more complicated than that. And so she asked me several years ago whether I would give such a lecture, and I said yes, foolishly. And then eventually she said, well, when are you going to do this? So I had to do it. Now, here's an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm first going to make a few general thoughts about the biological basis of behavior and remind you of the overly deterministic view of biological variables and behavior that we all slip into way too easily. And then we're going to talk about some studies of gene, hormones, and behavior. I'm going to use examples from my own work, and those some of you may know, almost all my work is on birds, although I have about 10 papers on mammals. But I'm going to talk about the avian work, which shows some general principles that are broadly applicable, and I'm going to relate those to humans, as Hoda has suggested. In particular, I'm going to talk about how context effects influence how testosterone regulates behavior, and this idea of the challenge hypothesis that I was one of the formulators of 30 years ago. Also, behavioral interactions can induce changes in hormone secretion and gene expression, and how our own activities feed back on brain and plasticity, and talk about the significance of these feedback loops and our understanding of how biological and social behavioral variables interact. And then a little bit about how we should think about biological variables and behavior at the end. So, as behavioral and social scientists, we tend to stress explanations related to environmental experience effects on behavior, including the effects of culture. These are very powerful effects, extremely important in human behavior. And if you take a survey of BSOS, by and large, the whole college is dealing with this broad category in one way or another. Now, the biological approach can be caricatured, especially because of early attempts, as based on the biological determinant movement, which looked at variables such as genotype, brain size, aspects of physiology. And people tended to say, well, that's something that's measurable and physical, and we see that, and that causes behavior to immutable. And there was, in general, a tendency to give overly deterministic models that came from that. And of course, we all know that's oversimplified, but it's amazing when you look at the press, how often these kinds of things pop up, and you see biases in thinking. So how should we think about these variables today? Well, as Hoda alluded to in Robert Sapolsky's book, which I'm going to show you a picture of very soon, remember that behavioral, environmental, social effects are mediated by the brain and physiology. People talk about, well, I went to a psychiatrist, I got the talking cure, or the psychiatrist gave me drugs. How does the so-called talking cure work? It changes your brain. That's what happens when you do psychotherapy. There's gene changes, and even probably, if we had to find enough tools, structural changes that occur when you go through this process. And other related physiological systems like the endocrine system and the immune system are, of course, also important. So there's this interconnected web of causation, and it's our challenge to untangle. And so I'm going to look at a couple of examples with real data from animals that will be illustrative purposes, something to sort of see how this works. And then we'll just talk about, well, do our genes end up placing and other biological various constraints on our behavior that we just have to recognize. And I want to put a plug in here. So Robert was a graduate student when I was a postdoc at Rockefeller in Bruce McEwen's laboratory. I knew he was a star then. I didn't know he was going to be such a great star. He's a MacArthur Award winner professor at Stanford, and he has just written this book, which took him 10 years to write. And it is one of the best accounts of the causes of behavior ever written, and it's written in a way accessible for educated people broadly. So everyone in this room can enjoy it. I will say it's not short. I just published a review of it, and being old-fashioned, I felt I should read the book before I wrote the review, and it took damn near 3 months to get through the whole thing. But it's worth it, because he's very funny. It's a fabulous book. For instance, his chapter on the adolescent brain development, which is, we now know that the cortical projections to the frontal cortex don't develop until mid-20s, and that's one of the reasons for impulsive. And he's like, dude, where's my cortex? That's the chapter title. All right, so we're going to first talk about testosterone and aggressive behavior, a topic which I started my career studying back in the day. And when you talk about this, it's always good to start with this guy that my friends in behavioral endocrinology field will know. He was a German scientist named Berthold who did a simple experiment in the 1840s which actually laid out some principles to the field. Now, we go back to Aristotle. People knew that the testis was important. And Aristotle reports in Historia Animalia how people were doing castrations. And Berthold did this in roosters. So a normal rooster grows up and it has characteristics which are male typical, morphological and behavioral. The comb and the wattles. It mounts hens in a particular way, and hens engage in copulatory behavior in a particular way. It can be very aggressive, and it gives a loud crow, a cock-a-doodle-doo. If you remove the testis, there's a remarkable change, and it's important to note here, in morphology and in behavior, that a suite of traits that seemingly have independent controls. The behavior, of course, is controlled by the central nervous system primarily. These are completely different effects of morphology, and removing the testis changes all of these at once. And the male actually looks almost female-like. However, he did one thing that hadn't been done before. When he took the testes out, he put them back in, or he put them in another bird, and he let them reimplant on the body wall, right? And it's remarkable how well that worked. All the traits came back. The behavior, the morphology, the physiology. And what did this tell us? Well, first, there must be a blood-borne factor produced by the testis that can have these set of effects, because it didn't hook up right. It just randomly accumulates on the body cavity. And we now know that this blood-borne factor is the steroid hormone we call testosterone. And steroids such as testosterone and another one called cortisol, which is a stress hormone, they are powerful endogenous factors that can induce gene expression. And this is very important. These are transcription factors. They turn on genes. And so therefore, any tissue with the right target, a whole suite of traits, can be coordinated for an organized adaptive response. So for example, stress requires a whole set of things to be done at once. Cortisol coordinates those. Reproduction requires your behavior, your physiology, your anatomy, all to be ready to find a mate, court a mate, exchange gametes, etc., etc. And in males, testosterone does that. Okay. Now, you say, well, that's a rooster. What does it have to do with us? Right? We're humans. Humans are different. Unfortunately, the experiment was done for a long time in our history. And this was the tradition of castration that was used very sadly on boys and men in human societies, and several of them did over the years. And the effects are very clear. Now, what I'm going to illustrate is in Italy in the 18th century, there was a habit of castrating boys for musical reasons. That is a full-grown male, genotypically and in many aspects of the phenotype, who was castrated early in life to be an opera and church singer. We don't need to go through the whole song. I think you get the point. That's a remarkable voice for an adult male. These things are very powerful factors. And of course, the thickening of the vocal cords didn't happen because the steroid wasn't present, which is one thing that leads to the sex difference in pitch and timbre that we have in males and females. This is another eunuch that was one of the last ones in Imperial. So both of these examples, the recording and the photograph, were done in the 19th century, and then they lived into the modern times enough with the dawn of photography and the dawn of recording. Oh, right, and the castration occurred in the 19th century, and then they were able to be recorded. Now, I taught a behavioral endocrinology course with Pharaoh Madison for many years, who's here now at University of Maryland, and like many scientists who work on interesting topics, you sometimes attract cranks. And I had someone write me and send me this book, Castration, the Advantages and Disadvantages. He had his testis removed for medical reasons, and he decided that this was a great thing. And he then became an advocate for it, and he wrote this entire book and self-published it, saying that this should be a regular practice in human society, and he asked if I wanted to use this book in my class. I did not, but it was very interesting. He said, do you know, Professor Ball, he wrote this long handwritten letter, that if for castration we'd have a decrease in crime, we'd have a decrease in war, we'd have all these things would be better. And I said, yes, that's probably true, but it's a rather radical solution. So, how do hormones work? Just very briefly, just to remind you, they're released by endocrine glands without ducts. They're released into the blood, and because they're released in the blood, they can go anywhere in the body. Anywhere that has the right kind of receptor for the target. Now, the steroids have an unusual set of receptors which are actually inside the cell, as seen here. So the steroid is lipophilic. It can cross the lipid bilayer, the cell membrane, many of you are familiar with receptors that sit on the edge of the cell. They actually go into the cell. They form a complex with the receptor and dimers. This is obviously an oversimplification. There's many other proteins recruited for this to happen. But they go into the cell nucleus, or they're in the cell nucleus, they interact with the DNA, and they turn on genes. This is why athletes take anabolic steroids. They want to turn on genes, in their case, in the muscles, so that they can get bigger and stronger muscles, because just like the steroid induces the comb of the rooster, it induces muscles in mammals, in male mammals, and it can do that. And the effects are especially striking when you take exogenous steroids in women. The East Germans gave their women testosterone in a very outrageous fashion without telling them, and they had doctoral dissertations that showed how it increased their performance tremendously on different kinds of events. Now, however, okay, you say, okay, the steroid acts on a receptor and you lead to this behavior. Does it cause behavior? Not in the simple way in which we think about a stimulus and a response. Behavior is controlled by this simple circuit. You have sensory inputs, you perceive something, a stimulus there. Then you have a central processing system, the brain and the spinal cord, which processes it and responds to it. And that hooks up to effector organs where you do something. And one of the effects of an effector organ will be behavior. Now, if you just give someone a hormone, they're not going to immediately do the behavior. What does the hormone do? It changes the probability and the intensity of the response. So the presence of the hormone will make how you respond to a stimulus situation radically different in some cases, or just a little bit different, or not different at all, depending on the stimulus situation you're in. So this can be a key modulatory variable, but it is not a deterministic variable. You know, we have lots of testosterone in this room right now, I suspect. Nobody's fighting. It's the wrong context, and I hope no one will, to say things. So, let's talk about what the relationship is. Now, in the animal kingdom, let's face facts. Agonistic behavior is widespread. Just about every species does it. Here's some birds. These are cyclic fishes. Here's a Galapagos iguana. Here's a frog. They're displaying. And what happens? Well, you can get these behaviors. Obviously, violence can occur in the context of predator and prey. That's related to fear-induced. You can also have maternal aggression. So mothers in the animal kingdom are among some of the vicious animals that you can challenge in the right context. That's why you don't have your kids take a picture with the bear cub when mom's nearby, in case you didn't know that. It's called maternal aggression, and she will kill you. Now, the other thing, which is more common, which we deal with, is social conflict. And this is the most complex one. Why is it that in behaving social groups, we have sometimes all kinds of fighting, conflict going on, and other times, like with humans here, we can sit together in a group with people who are, when you talk to a primatologist, they say, what is the most striking thing about humans? You can have males and females who have reached puberty sitting in a room quietly without fighting over getting access to each other. There's almost no other primate where that can happen. Now, so what's the dogma that we're dealing with here? So this is a quote from a paper in Scientific American about 10 years ago. It's commonly assumed that testosterone, that stereotypically male hormone, is intimately tied to violence. The evidence is all around us. Weightlifters who overuse anabolic steroids experience roid rage. And castration, the removal, has been a staple of animal husbandry for centuries. This is the kind of bias that we have. Is it true? And the answer is no. It's an oversimplification, but so is it inexorably linked to violence? What controls it? So when I was a postdoctoral fellow, I worked with a group at Rockefeller, and we published this paper, and I hope you won't find me pretentious to say it's a key paper. It's reaching its 30th anniversary, and it's about 2,000 citations. And we pulled together work we had been doing on wild birds, where we had actually been letting birds have their natural social behavior in the field, and we would cleverly catch them very briefly, take very small blood samples, and then measure hormone changes and try to relate them to the different behaviors. And we came up with this scheme. So testosterone will be at a very low level when animals are non-breeding. These are all seasonal breeders. When they breed, it increases to a baseline, which is necessary for reproduction. But when you're in the field, this much higher level, which is C, are levels of testosterone that can be reached, but are only reached in certain social situations. And one of the social situations is when animals are challenged in a social situation. So here we have a simple version of the challenge hypothesis. Testosterone is elevated, but only under socially challenging conditions. So for instance, this male red-winged blackbird, which many of you are probably familiar with, it's a very common bird around here, it's going to be back soon singing. If you simulate a territorial intrusion, you'll get a big increase in the androgen by about 10 minutes. And this increase then feeds back and leads to changes in its behavior. But if you don't have this challenge, even though it has circulating testosterone, its behavior will be very calm and it won't feed it. Now, what does this challenge look like? I'm going to use David Attenborough's help.
But a bird's call can tell another bird more than just what kind of bird it is that's singing. This patch of bush on a small offshore New Zealand island belongs to a male saddleback. He's held it throughout the year, and he knows who his neighbours are because their calls vary slightly, and he can recognise each one individually. And there he is.
You notice the saddle-colored back.
He keeps in regular contact with his neighbours. They each answer his call, and he can distinguish between them in the same way that we can distinguish between regional dialects. A northerner, a southerner, and someone from the East Coast.
A loudmouth.
If the right call comes from the right place, then he knows that his territory is safe from intruders, and he can happily go back to feeding. But if the call is from a saddleback, and it's one that he doesn't recognize, and if, as well as that, it comes from a completely new place, then he will react in a very different way. And of course, it's quite easy for me to make that happen.
He does seem very pleased with himself.
I'm going to play him a recording of a saddleback from a different island. His response is swift and very aggressive. He comes down for a closer look. He gives another warning. This is a serious challenge to his territory. It can't be tolerated. Now, since his rival seems to be somewhere close by, he's making a visual threat, displaying the brown patch on his back. He's ready to fight, if only he could find who it is who needs fighting. Well, I guess that's enough of that.
It is, David. Thank you so much. Okay, so this illustrates a couple of things. One, I'm not going to talk about this today, but these are learned songs, and they actually have these geographic variation, which are called dialects, and they recognize individual neighbors. So when something is amiss, they immediately say, what is this? Is this a challenge to my situation? And they behave aggressively. Now, what you can do, what David doesn't do, is you can set up these very thin nets called mist nets. They were invented in Japan. And then you can capture the bird while it's going after the aggressive display and take a very small blood sample. The modern techniques of hormone analysis are such, and then assess changes in its physiology, and release the bird, and you can assess changes in its physiology in response to these kinds of challenges. And what you find is that this is done in a different species than the saddleback, but a closely related one, is that by about 10 minutes you have a very significant uptick in the testosterone, this rise, and this is luteinizing hormone, the pituitary hormone that drives steroid synthesis. And the testosterone starts to go up, but the really high level comes in conjunction with the LH. And so you see that the behavioral interaction, the challenge, drives the change in the hormone, and then that hormone is high, and the male goes into a different state. When we would watch these males in these interactions, they would be fighting the rest of the day. They would be patrolling around, who's there, who's this, challenging, going up to them, and that kind of stuff. So the presence of the hormone is elicited by the social interaction, and that feeds back and leads, and it changes the probability that they'll get in a conflict situation. Now, our group and other groups, we studied a wide variety of species, and this is some of the summary of our results of what it looks like over a breeding season. So you have pre-breeding, sexual, parental care, sexual, parental. So you say, well, what's going on with these peaks of testosterone? This is song sparrows. They come back to their site. There's no females, just males. They fight like hell and set up territories. Then everyone calms down. Then the females arrive. Then they all fight like hell to get access to the females and pair off, and then everyone calms down and takes care of their eggs. This is some of my data on starlings. They're hole nesters who are close together, and they fight over a limited resource, the holes. In the first breeding, you have this higher peak of testosterone. Not all the birds lay a second brood, so the density drops, and when the density drops, the testosterone drops. Down here in the western gull, you say, well, what's going on with them? There's almost no testosterone. They are colonial nesters who feed in these offshore places in which there's plenty of food. They just nest together, and there's not much resource to fight. They're monogamous. The males and females work together. There's hardly any fighting there and any testosterone. So you see within these birds, the diversity in the social behavior of the males is reflected in the diversity of the testosterone patterns. And this is a good illustration of how you have to know the social situation. One of my colleagues, Bob Hegner, studied these house sparrows. If you just map the date of the testosterone and the LH, you say, well, it goes up in March, it's present over a long breeding season, goes down in August. But what happens is the birds start mating and nesting slightly out of sequence. If you replot the data so that it's based on whether they're in the sexual phase or the parental phase, what you see is actually happening is a set of peaks over the course of the summer. And when they're in the competitive, challenging situation, the testosterone is high, and when they're out of it, it drops down. And the other thing you may be noticing is that what we discovered is that there's an incompatibility between the high testosterone and being parental. You need situations where the male-male competition drops down, because remember in these birds, male parental care is very common and very important, right? There's no gestation, there's no lactation. The female lays an egg, the male can sit on it just as much as the female. So you have much more, males can basically share pregnancy in that species. And also, when the egg hatches, they both can feed it. They're bringing insects and things like that. So biparental care is way more common in birds than in mammals. The role of the male is dependent on the social situations, whether he has high T and he's compatible. I'm not going to show the data, but you can actually give a parental male testosterone and he will abandon the nest and go off fighting. God forbid. Now, so males in situations of low social confidence and with the appropriate social support tend to have low testosterone and low levels of aggression. Are these context effects of testosterone present in humans? Very interesting work doing salivary testosterone. A lot of this work is done in agonistic situations. This guy, Mazer, wanted to study something else. He looked at chess players in a tournament over several weeks, and he would collect salivary samples and measure testosterone in the winners and the losers. And he found a very prominent effect that in the winners, the testosterone tended to be very high, and in the losers, the testosterone went down. So the ones who were in a challenging situation and were succeeding were getting higher testosterone, and that was driving them. But even things like this is a World Cup soccer match between Brazil and Italy. Those on the winning team had a big rise in testosterone, and those on the losing team, these aren't the players, these are people watching it, right? So they have that. And so you see why there's all these, with the Philadelphia Eagles, people were saying, I don't understand, they won the game and they're tearing up the town. I mean, the problem is, of course, this is conflicted by the fact that they're all drinking heavily. But even if we set that aside, it's very highly probable that in the males at least, there was sky-high testosterone, and this was feeding some of the stuff you might have seen on the news of them destroying property and things like that in Philadelphia. So, that's one theme on the testosterone. Another theme is how one's own behavior can feed back on hormone-dependent plasticity. And here I'm going to talk about song and how it's controlled. This is just to remind you of the remarkable seasonal change that occurs in these animals. So these are starlings that I studied, and they grow their gonads. This is day length. And they're highly seasonal, and they're active for a very short period of time, and it's tied to the food they have to feed their young. So they feed their young these insects that are available here and aren't available here. This is the same gland over time. Yes, that is the same as that. And that's what happens to the testes seasonally. So they really go through the equivalent of puberty every year, where they shut down the whole system, their voice changes and all that, and then they get secretions of the testosterone again. And a lot of traits are controlled by testosterone, this yellow beak and this base of the bill. Yellow beak means they have testosterone. By the way, we have starlings on campus. So I want all of you to look at their beaks. And if you see that they're yellow, you can tell your colleagues, oh, they have measurable testosterone now. You see the yellow beak? And they'll know that you're an impressive scientist, especially if you're from the Bees Business School and you say that. They'll be blown away. Now, what happens to the brain? Well, these are brain areas, and these are sections of the brain that you collect that. And they're very important for the control of song. Guess what? The gonad changes and the brain changes. These are volumes, and you can compare those to the winter. So that the areas that control a behavior that changes seasonally also change in morphology seasonally. And this is done because the steroid is a transcription factor. This diagram you've seen before. This one shows a bit more detail about how the hormone binds to the receptor, and then this is the DNA. It recruits these proteins, and then it leads to gene transcription. And this diagram illustrates it. There's the structure of testosterone. That's the classic steroid structure. BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a key compound substance that's important in the development of the brain. In the seasonal change of the brain, testosterone regulates that BDNF gene and upregulates it and allows the brain to remodel. So seasonal changes in the brain recapitulate ontogeny to some extent. It's not perfect to some extent. And then you end up with this song activation. And here's a picture, high T experimentally, and then you see they sing more, and they have a bigger nucleus with the high T. Now, testosterone acts on many different parts of the song in separate ways. And this diagram summarizes a lot of work we've done over the past 10 years. I'm not going to go over it all in detail, but the important theme is that those song nuclei are important for the quality of the song itself, how stereotypic it is, how reliable, how attractive it is to a female. But whether or not they sing, the desire to sing is controlled by testosterone acting in the preoptic area, which is close to the hypothalamus. These areas are very common in vertebrates. So T affects song in independent ways and different aspects. Now it turns out we know from development that the brain develops by use it or lose it. They overproduce neural connections, right? And the ones that don't tie up in active things die away. So you know you make many more cells than you use, and over the course of development, your brain prunes those to set up the circuit. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor is released in an activity-dependent fashion during ontogeny, and that's one of the reasons it allows for the formation of these connections. It turns out that song activity in adulthood also releases the BDNF, and you get a change in the number of cells expressing it. So one of the things we discovered is that yes, testosterone can upregulate BDNF and lead to these changes in SCN stands for song control nuclei, but just changing the motivation to sing, just changing the activity to sing can actually feed back on the brain and generate BDNF itself. So what you do can actually change the gene expression in the brain as much as the hormone itself. And this diagram kind of summarizes many of these different effects where testosterone can act on motivation. DCX is a marker for new neurons. The birds have a very high rate of adult neurogenesis. That's another part of the story, which I'm not going to go into detail. And those morphological changes I showed you in the brain, in some cases involve the incorporation of newly born neurons into the circuit. That's one of the reasons why they're so interesting, is they renew their brains seasonally. And the hormones facilitate that, but also what we've shown is the presence of a mate can facilitate that independently of the hormones, and your activity can facilitate that independently of the hormones. Now, the related theme is that how social interactions actually turn on genes in particular ways. So we see how steroids are dependent on context and can affect your probability of engaging in aggressive behavior. Then we see how the same genes turned on by the steroid can be turned on by your own interactions and your behavior. And now we're talking about how perception actually results in gene changes in your brain, especially social signals. So this is a map of the songbird brain. I'm not going to go over it in detail, but I want to stress that these are auditory areas, and these are the areas that control song. This is a sideways view of the brain, like this. This diagram shows that. There's a strong relationship between the auditory and the motor areas because, as I told you before, the song is learned, and auditory memories form the motor output in important ways. David Clayton did this experiment a few years ago where he played back song and he looked at gene expression for an immediate early gene. This is a bird hearing song. This is a radioactive probe that measures the RNA production. You see this massive induction of the gene, and this is a bird hearing silence. So song, in particular conspecific song, turns on genes in this area. If you play, these are the same songs. The zebrafinch responds like this to zebrafinch song and like this to canary song. The canary responds like this to canary song and like this to zebrafinch song. So your brain is expressing, and these immediate early genes also form proteins that form transcription factors that turn on other genes. We then took it even further and showed that the song the female uses to choose a male, a lot of these songbirds pick a male based on aspects of their song. So for instance, in these starlings, females like males who produce really long songs. Look at that thing, it goes on and on. So the longer the song, the more apt the female is to like the male. And you might ask why. We actually studied that. These males have more robust immune systems based on the measure. So those traits are correlated for reasons we're not sure of. But the female is actually picking a higher quality male when she predicts the long bout song. So we did an experiment where we played back either short bout song of a certain amount, long bout song of a certain amount, or just less song. And the results were very clear. The female's gene expression was highest. These cells are all cells expressing that gene. Each dot is a cell expressing the gene when they heard the long bout song, not the short bout song or the low song. So the brain is actually biased to express genes specifically in response to the song that they behaviorally perceive. And this is based on experience. I'm not going to go over all the experiments, but we actually had the females grow up in environments or experience environments where the song of the male varied differently, and we could manipulate how their brain responded in genes based on the experience. So you see that the experience in the early learning tunes the gene expression in the brain in order a way for them to make an adaptive behavioral response. This is the quantification. You can just see in all the brain sections the long bout song is inducing more genes. The last experiment has to do with these white-crowned sparrows out west that my postdocs worked on with me. They have these dialects, like David Attenborough showed, where they, in one mountain pass, they sing a particular kind of song. In another mountain pass, it's slightly different. So the Sonora Pass dialect and the Rocky Mountain. You can see these are similar, but nonetheless, you know, this buzz is here and that's not there. They have more opening notes. They have this. So it's typical to the kind of accent or something you would have in human speech. Now, we looked at whether they prefer, females who grow up in the dialect prefer the dialect they grew up with, and whether their brain prefers it. And first, we asked whether, if you play the song, how do females respond to it? And the answer is very clear. Just hearing the song, the females will display to the speaker. You know how that male wanted to attack the speaker? The females will actually solicit the speaker playing the song they like to encourage the male to come with her. And the Hatch dialect always elicits more of these behaviors than the foreign dialect. So they prefer this song. And when you look at the gene expression, the same thing happens. Now I want to remind you, they don't have an innate predisposition for this Hatch dialect. They hear this dialect being sung when they're young birds in the nest, and they learn that preference. And that learned preference has correlated with it this change in gene expression. And so you see that there's a correlation between the amount of gene expression and their behavior and preference to the dialect. We have two different brain areas. The reason why there's two regression lines here is there's two different brain areas that have slightly different numbers there, but the main point is the same. Okay. Genes regulated by steroids can also be regulated by activity-dependent changes in behavior. Thus, brain changes can be mediated by endogenous factors such as testosterone, but also by their own social interactions. Experience in the social environment can influence gene expression in profound ways. Engaging in interactions with a potential mate can have marked expressors on gene expression. Thus, you can control the significance of whether you possess a particular gene by what you do and how you interact with conspecifics. The gene will be modulated by what experience you have and what situation you're in. And finally, and for this section, one particularly powerful effect relates to epigenetic effects, something I didn't mention in here. But, you know, Lamarck was wrong. We're all born with genes and they're inherited. But there are environmental effects that will lead to the silencing of genes, which is called epigenetics. They'll be methylated. And you can actually, through experience, lead to marks on the genome so that that gene, even though you have it, is not going to be expressed. It'll be silenced temporarily. So you see that this is what Sapolsky concluded in his book, which is absolutely right, that you can't separate these two things out. And hearing about a gene doesn't mean you're hearing about some immutable thing that can't change. So what are the general principles? This is a science paper that some of my colleagues wrote a few years ago, in which they tried to summarize the complex relationships between genes, brain, and social behavior. So you have social interactions which can feed back on brain function and can lead to changes in the genome. You also have changes in the genome that can change brain function, and that can lead to individual changes that result in social interaction. And here, this has been studied in a systematic way by all these different species, including songbirds, cichlid fish, honeybees, etc. So this kind of illustrates these points. You have social information processed by the brain leading to changes in gene and modification, and these can be alterations in brain and behavior. You know, as I said, your behavior can actually lead to physical changes in your brain. And another example in humans I want to bring home has to do with drug addiction. You know, why is it so hard after someone has abused, say, cocaine, and we get them off cocaine? And if you talk to the therapist, they say, well, the craving, it's the return which is the difficult. We know from the animal studies their brain has changed. By taking this cocaine, by engaging in it, by responding to people, they make associations. The reward systems are actually neurochemically different. And so it's not the same person who's now facing the situation post-cocaine after they took it. And we can sort of see that with an abuse of a substance. But what I'm saying is that even your natural behaviors, if you start doing something typically, you're going to lead to changes and drive circuits, which then will predispose you, we hope, to behave in an adaptive way. And this is the other dynamic, in which genes, RNAs coding proteins, can determine brain cells that lead to changes in social behavior. This is the one we're more used to. But it's important that realize that even this process is subject to environmental effects on genes, on the gene expression, and can be modulated. Now, I'm sitting here saying, well, you know, they're both involved in their shows, but do biological variants place limits? And, you know, it's an interesting thing. It's important to realize. I mean, we know the limits of human performance. You know, I always hoped to be a star on the Washington Senators when I was growing up, but no matter how hard I practiced at baseball, I don't think I would ever make it. And I suspect there is a genetic limitation there. We know at the extremes we have that. But I want to talk about something else. You know, one of the things in the birds we look at a lot are differences in the sexes. And, you know, in humans, most of them are highly malleable. They're small in magnitude. There aren't prominent sex differences in behavior in humans, at least compared to what we see in animals. But there's one, the incarceration rate. Been very interested in this, and you know, Vsauce is lucky to have a fabulous criminology and criminal justice department. And I've often said that all societies incarcerate more men than women. And I called Lauren Porter, who's a faculty member in criminology, and I said, is this really true? What does it look like? And she sent me to some databases. Turns out that the highest rate is 20% of all your prisoners women in Hong Kong, and the lowest rate is 0%. So in 230 or 40 countries, the 0%, by the way, was in San Marino. I think they incarcerate 10 guys, and they're all guys. But so every society, there's this huge difference in incarceration rate based on the sexes. And you know, you might ask why. I mean, I know why. Women control all the power, and they suppress men, and they take advantage of us and put us in jail. Now, everyone laughs. That's a ridiculous statement. I mean, that's absurd. And we all know why. Because I taught a course with a social psychologist years ago back at Hopkins, and this topic came up. And she just looked at me and said, it's all that damn testosterone. I said, that's part of it. Interestingly, the U.S., in terms of numbers, because our incarceration rate is so high, we imprison more women than any other country in the world. But our incarceration rate is about 10%. And this is per 100,000, this is a few years old now. 1,352 men are incarcerated and 126 women. This is changing over time. It's actually going up. I got very interested in this. I started looking at states. There's remarkable differences in states in the United States. So this is not, the numbers are not an absolute trait. There's all kinds of social, cultural effects that can influence the relative. But the basic sex difference, you know, I asked myself, what would we ever, would this ever be reversed and equal? And you know, I don't, it's an open question. I don't want to pretend I know for sure. But I suspect this would, unless we follow the advice of that man who sent me the book on castration, I think you know, I think that is tapping in to some differences in our nature that probably aren't, although they're affected by a lot of things and there's overlap and all that kind of stuff, the overall pattern. And you know, one theme of these Peace Chair lectures has been the importance of involving women more in government and decision making. Both Hoda's invited some speakers, May Rihani, who's now doing a major project in the Middle East, is focusing on empowering women in the political process. So it's an interesting thought. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to take some questions. I want to thank over the years. This is my group when I was still at Johns Hopkins. These are my collaborators in Belgium. There's Professor Dooling, who I've been working with, and Melvin Rouse, who graduated. Here's our current group here at University of Maryland. Some of these students have left, but Tara, Farah, Nora, Adam, Ali are all still here. Sheldon just went to graduate school, and then we have Chelsea and Ed who aren't here. But I have a terrific group that I'm lucky enough to work with. Being dean, the only way I can get anything done is working in a team. So, or pretending to work in a team. Anyway, I want to thank, this is my hometown, Baltimore. This is the pride of Baltimore, and I've been lucky enough to get some support from the NIH over the years, and thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
I'll just ask you that if you could raise your hands. There are two microphones that I'll have the students bring over to you so everyone can hear the question. Over here? Just wait for her. Greg.
No, it's right there.
Right. She's right there, right there.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you.
You talked about
Yes.
animals fighting over females.
Correct.
My question is, in war, there is so much rape of women. Part of it is to humiliate the women's men, but is there something else about it? How do they...
Well, in the birds, it's very clear they only fight over them when they're fertile. And there's actually a lot of experiments where you modulate whether the birds are ovulating, and if there's not a chance of fertilizing them, the males lose interest. And so there it's clearly adaptive. In humans, of course, we have a whole nother complex set of culture. In the birds, it's all implicit, of course. Remember that. We don't think there's any kind of conscious calculation going on. You know, there's a lot of talk about implicit cognition in humans, and I'm used to dealing with that all the time because my subjects do everything implicitly, and they do a lot of complicated things. You know, there's some controversy where people look at the data. There is absolutely evidence that some kind of war is tied to access to females. Who was the speaker you had who talked about if you want to understand terrorism, you need to understand the bride price?
Valerie Hudson.
Valerie Hudson. She did an analysis on, was it Boko? Where was it? Was in Africa? Was it? I apologize. I can't remember the details.
I can't remember either.
She showed that the recruitment of males into these terrorist armies was directly related to the bride price. When they could not get access to females, they recruited them by saying, if you join our army, you'll get access to females and you'll have that. Now, when you talk psychologically, whether it's just tied to reproductive fitness or it's tied to these other things like humiliation, certainly that's going on. This is an old argument. Of course, Susan Brown Miller first generated it in the 1960s when there were discussions. But it's important to remember there could be something adaptive going on and no one's aware of it, right? These things can be implicit. If a male is explicitly saying why he does it, that may not be the ultimate reason in evolutionary terms.
Let's see.
You said you don't understand or don't know why female incarceration rates are so much lower than males, but is it at all possible that it could be tied to the challenge theory?
Oh, yeah. Did I say? I mean, I think I do. Yeah. I mean, they're much less violent and aggressive, much lower probability of engaging in that.
But is it at all possible that it's not necessarily that they are to some extent, but possibly also...
Oh, yes, absolutely. If we design societies where males are in supportive environments and have access to resources and go, yes, absolutely. Yes, we can decrease that. Yeah. It's just that in the same situation, you're going to have a much higher probability of incarcerating males. But the high rate we have in our society, I'm very much convinced it's a sign of pathology.
Did you have your hand up? Yes, right here. Oh, yeah, okay.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. So, in this whole nature versus nurture debate, it seems as though you are forefronting nurture as probably something that we can all use to change our gene expressions.
Well, I'm denying the question.
Okay, you're denying the
The
question.
nature versus nurture. We have a causal sequence. I think right now we don't know what that exactly means. So how can something be pure nature?
Right.
So what would be a pure nature effect?
Yeah, I don't know that, and that's why I'm asking the
Yeah,
question.
so all nature, what would be a pure nurture effect? Sorry. What's a pure nurture effect? You say, well, gee, this experience leads to a change, but how? How? There's a change we do know. There's a change in the brain, in many cases, not every case. So there's no, we're not dualists. There's the only way to lead to changes in behavior is through the nervous system. There's no, at least me, I respect anyone who takes a dualist point of view, but I'm a scientist. And in terms of explanations, there's no extra system out there we can invoke. So see, that's the problem, is people say, well, look at this powerful effect of experience and nurture. Absolutely. And look at that change in behavior. Absolutely. But how did that happen? It happened because of perception in the brain and changes in activity. And sometimes, so learning, I used to do a thought experiment with my intro psych class, and I said, there's no exams. We're going to scan everyone's brain tomorrow afternoon. Then you're going to take a semester class, and then we're going to scan your brains again, and I'm going to see what you learned. And you'll get your grade based on that. And I told them, the students all went, what? And I said, I'm here to change your brain. And they would look at me, and I said, I'm serious. Because learning, of course, involves change. Now, it turns out we can scan the brain and show that something's happening, but we can't scan the brain and determine whether you understand calculus. I don't know if that was helpful.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, there's a question.
On this side?
Thank you. Later in your talk, you were talking about how testosterone-induced gene expression is only temporary. I was wondering what makes it different from like regular lysine non-methylation that makes it only temporary?
So sometimes the effects can be enduring, right? Especially early in development. The consequences, at least, will be enduring. But in some genes, especially in adulthood, you'll have an upregulation of the gene, and then there'll be some kind of feedback loop, and the testosterone is not there. Remember that in order to do the transcription, you need to have the transcription factor. It turns on a gene which can lead to a protein. That protein may break down, or it may be enduring. That's all I meant.
And also, how does the testosterone itself directly attack the gene and target which genes it needs to express or to silence? Or does it just attach onto other epigenetic factors?
Just testosterone?
Does it directly attack other genes in order to methylate it?
I see. Testosterone is not a methylation factor. I should have been more careful about that. I just added that in. The methylation occurs by other kind of compounds. That I was making a general point about experience effects on genes. The big news is that's most disturbing, as you may know, is that genes for the mother's experience on the pup affects genes involved in the HPA, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So the feedback loop of corticosterone in response to stress is changed by how much the mother takes care of you. And that has obviously implications for things that go on in human societies where we have variation in gene. Farah, what's the gene that's methylated? It's the receptor. It's the GR itself that's methylated, right? Yeah. It's the receptor, not the, yeah. So, but that's an experience effect, yes.
One more question? Yes?
So at college graduation these days, there are 3 women for every 2 men who walk across, who receive a degree. So is there some aspect of brain or brain development that contributes to this?
It's an interesting question, why we're seeing these changes. And the short answer is no, there's not a simple correlate in that area that's happening. But there is something going on that's disturbing. You know, one of the things I often say is people will say, well, you know, unisex schools are out of date, they're stupid, they don't prepare you for real society. You know, I'm not so sure. I think, you know, we should be willing to consider, we treat individuals developmentally different than adulthood all the time. We'll have a special thing, and there could be a time when same-sex schools could be useful for certain things and then change. And again, I don't want, it's complicated, depends on the society and the culture. But the short answer to your question is that change, that social change which is observed, there's a few theories kicking around about how early trauma, actually Oscar's not here, is he? No. Oscar Barber, Chair of African American Studies, has been looking in males at the achievement gap between African Americans and non-African American males. And he has some theories about social trauma leading to changes in the activation of the adrenal axis, which he thinks is contributing to them during key years not making progress. It's a very interesting theory.
I think there was
Yes, please. She's had her hand up.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Her first, and then you will be the last one.
Thank you. I acknowledge that men are incarcerated at a much higher rate than women. But what are they incarcerated for? Are all those crimes violent crimes?
Certainly not.
Yeah, so how does that affect your conclusions?
Well, the effects of testosterone are way more than just violence. It's also risk-taking. There's a whole configuration of traits associated with this male syndrome. I focused on that. But, you know, the willingness to take certain kinds of chances and all that. So, you know, you still can have aspects of the hormone that can affect these other kinds of crimes. They shouldn't too narrowly define their function. That's one of the challenges with hormones, is that they have this whole complex suite of traits. And in humans, we've underestimated the effects on the brain for a long time. You know, that's why this big uncontrolled experiment we're doing with anabolic steroids is so interesting. I collect information of reports on the athletes taking the steroids. And they report all kinds of changes in their feelings besides aggression when they're jacked up on these pharmacological levels of testosterone.
Last question, right in front of.
So if I may follow up on this question a little bit. So I understand the relationship between the challenge and the production of testosterone is something that you can measure. What I'm having a harder time understanding is the relationship between testosterone and subsequent behavior, because it's possible that both the subsequent behavior and the level of testosterone are caused by the challenge. And so are there any studies that you can speak to that have been able to separate out the two? Controlling for behavior by, for example, studying birds that grew up in situations where they didn't learn the behavior and observing what happens to those types of birds in challenge situations.
So yes, what you try, it's actually easier in the vocal situation, where you can give them the hormone and then prevent them from vocalizing. So some data I went over in doves is that the female will actually coo and stimulate her reproductive axis when she wants to ovulate. And she can push her estradiol to induce it. And in that case, you can actually silence her temporarily and look at the effect of the hormone, and you can block the hormone and look at the effect of the behavior and try to tease those out. In the case of aggression, it's very hard. You're absolutely right. Once you have those two things coming together, it's very hard to attribute cause to one or the other. And I would be reluctant to do that. You know, but of course then you end up saying to every question, well, it's complicated, which isn't very satisfying, I know.
I'd like to thank Dean Ball. Thank you so much.